Hello, today I'll be talking about wildlife trafficking for this project. For this project, I decided to break it down into six different sections. So, for the flow of information, I start with the introduction, introducing what wildlife trafficking is. Then I talk about trees, statistics, challenges, and constraints. And then I go on to talk about intergovernmental organizations' attempts to address wildlife trafficking. And I wrap it up with potential future endeavors to help address wildlife trafficking. And I also include an overarching analysis. So in the beginning, with what is wildlife trafficking, I start off with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service definition that says in the past decade, wildlife trafficking, the poaching or other taking of protected or managed species, and illegal trade in wildlife and their related parts and products has escalated into an international crisis. Essentially, this section just establishes what poaching is for people who may not know what it is. This section also talks about the increasing supply and demand and how this is an international issue because wildlife is being trafficked at very large quantities across international borders. The next part of this project is the existing treaties. I talk about two particular treaties, sites, the Convention on International Trade, Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and they also talk about the 1973 Agreement on the Conservation of Polar Bears. Both trees are relatively important. The first tree, sites, is really important because it's really inclusive. It talks about every species. It has 183 parties and it's been enforced since 1975. It's important because it also mandates reporting on extinction rates and trafficking seizures. And it's greatly expanded recently because of increased funding. The latter report on polar bears is particularly noteworthy because it was done during the Cold War, and it shows how countries are willing to put aside political differences in the name of environment when there's enough political pressure. This particular treaty was done by the countries with the highest polar bear rates, and this includes the USSR and the United States. The USSR obviously is now Russia, and this treaty has been remarkably successful. It's been directly linked with a distinct decrease in commercially based killings of polar bears. The next section, statistics and data about wildlife trafficking, I include two very noteworthy reports. The first one is the African Wildlife Foundation's research findings. Essentially, this foundation did research for 20 years in Africa and Asia on elephants and rhinos, and it shows an exponential decrease in the rhino's population side by side with the exponential increase in poaching. And it shows that the decrease in rhino population and elephant population is anything but natural. And it shows that at this rate, there won't be any rhinos or elephants left because of the unsustainable ways of poaching. The next report I included was the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime World Wildlife Crime Report, which is updated every 4 years. This just tracks how there's been a really rapid increase in sites related seizures. Sites is the previous tree I mentioned. It also talks about various products such as perfume, furniture, and fashion being used directly from poaching, which many consumers do not know about. The next report, or sorry, the next subject that I talked about was the challenges and constraints in the fight to stop wildlife trafficking. The first thing I included was the African Wildlife Fund's report on the lack of enforcement and linkage between socioeconomics and poaching. Essentially, this report talks about how many domestic law enforcement agencies lack the manpower to address poaching at its fullest, and also because of poor socioeconomics in many countries, the children are turning to poaching syndicates at a very young age because no other economic opportunities, so they feel like they have to. The next section I included was about how poachers are selling wildlife as captive bred. Essentially, they're misliving on purpose because under certain trees, you can internationally trade wildlife if it's captive bred, but you can't trade wildlife if it's found in nature. And here's a particularly disturbing image that shows a factory of dead captive bred turtles that were actually found in wildlife but slaughtered. And often these law enforcement agencies act too late because of many loopholes in treaties that don't allow them to examine these captive bred organizations quickly enough. The next section, I address the IGO's attempts to address wildlife trafficking. There are three distinct IGOs that do a pretty good job at this. The first one is the ICCWC. This is a collaboration between the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, Interpol, the World Bank, CITES, and World Customs Organization. Essentially, they created a state of the art database using surveillance technology from Interpol, and they track poaching syndicates across the world. It's been very successful, and it's resulted in the replacement of a lot of these syndicates, but unfortunately, more seem to keep popping up. Another IGO is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They've done a great job with community outreach because they realize, after research from the United Nations, that involving local people is critical to successful conservation because the current approaches to wildlife management often fail to take into account the needs and rights of local communities. So essentially, they try to reach out to the youth of these communities because they found that that's when kids are most impressionable. And by reaching out to them when they're young and educating them on environmental issues, they'll be less likely to turn to poaching because they'll understand the consequences more. The other IGO included was U.S. Fish and Wildlife's International Affairs because they have Wildlife Without Borders, which is the international arm of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they've donated a considerable amount of foreign aid to the Kenya Wildlife Service and Royal Thai Police. This is important because it's resulted in actually massive seizures of ivory, and it shows that when foreign aid is used correctly, it can result in something good happening. And the last section I included was the potential future endeavors. Essentially, broken down to two sections, there are two different projects or ideas that could help curb poaching in the future. The first one is the World Wildlife Fund's Wildlife Crime Technology Project. This is actually funded by Google because after research showed that it's a $10 billion industry, illegal trade is, and something needs to be done about it. They create a state-of-the-art technology to help combat poaching in certain countries because a lot of these countries, as I said before, lack manpower. Unfortunately, while the technology shows promise, there's a severe lack of trust in Western countries, rightfully so. And so they're trying to slowly implement the technology into various countries' law enforcement with limited success, but it shows possibility for potential in the future. The other future endeavor possible is by expanding the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Essentially, this would make a fourth protocol so that international trade of wildlife is illegal and it would expand the jurisdiction of sites in the United Nations, which would be instrumental in tackling poaching. Overall, for my overarching analysis, I found it interesting that many people try to say that killing these animals is a way of life and it's a circle of life, but they fail to take into account is that as humans, we're not killing these animals for survival. We're killing them for luxury purposes, selfish purposes, which is unsustainable. It's not like we're killing them just to consume them. Furthermore, the question was asked, what can my audience do with this information? And I think honestly, we do live in a first world country, but what we can do is that we can just be more mindful of where we're getting products from because a lot of us do use jewelry, perfume, purses, furniture, and we don't really take the time to consider where they're coming from. But if we buy less from certain sources known for poaching, then we might actually be able to put a dent in supply and demand. So that is it, and thank you for listening to my project.